Good morning, all. As Pat has led us so far, we're realising that we're into a new series, the Parables of Jesus. And this week I've spent a bit of time considering the beautiful piece of art that was created last week. And I'm a bit of an artist myself, and I marvel at somebody who's really good at detail, who can get out the detailed brush or the detail and create something so exquisite. And there's a part of me, if I was to imagine Jesus as an artist, is a little bit like this. Incredibly careful, incredibly trustworthy. And I look at this image of the hands and the cupped hands. They are careful and trustworthy hands. But what if you haven't lived a life that's careful? What if you've been a bit reckless? And what if you're not sure that you belong in this image? And as I've been sitting with the parables of Jesus this week, I want to suggest another picture of Jesus as artist, which is him with overalls on. And rather than a detailed brush, he's got the big roller out and he's just splashing colour everywhere. And he's expansive. The hands just aren't cupped and in tight. Jesus has got this expansive energy and he's just creating this big public art. I think the parables of Jesus have more in common with a big public mural than they do with an image like this, with no colour. And so if you'll allow me, I want to splash some paint around this morning and take a big picture approach to the parables. First thing I want to say, and it might be obvious already, is as we've been journeying this year with the lectionary readings, we've by and large been seeking to engage with Psalms and Old Testament and New Testament and Gospels. But through the month of September, if you are following along with the lectionary, something quite particular is happening in the Gospel lane and we're wanting to lean into there. Jesus is telling a series of parables on the road, and they're some of our most beloved parables, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. They all appear in this part of Luke's gospel, and they appear here only. And so we thought, actually, we're not doing away with the lectionary, but we're jumping into the gospel lane for the rest of this month. So the next 3 weeks, we've got 3 sermons on the parables. Now, Pat referred to a little bit of briefing that I gave her around where I was going. I was struck by the language that Jesus introduces. He started telling these stories, which he called parables. And literally in the Greek that the New Testament was written in, it just means something that's thrown alongside. He just throws this story alongside about a shepherd with a lost sheep, or about a woman looking for a lost coin, or about a loving father who has 2 very different sons. And you've got to start thinking, well, what's this story doing here? Why is Jesus throwing this alongside us? And I think it's a good question to sit with. What is Jesus up to? And I want to suggest 3 responses to that question. What are the parables doing here? The first is that I think Jesus is deliberately slowing us down. Slowing down our comprehension. This is not like his other teaching, which is very detailed, very careful. This is him throwing some colour around, talking about manure or something weird, and you've got to make sense of it. What's going on here? And that very question of what's going on here, it's meant to open us up. Penny, a couple of weeks ago, had the couch out here, and we were talking about the importance of humility and the importance of hospitality. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to dial up. When these stories are coming along, you don't know it all. Get into a more humble posture of being ready to learn, of being curious. And because they are such expansive stories, they're holding us in a different way. If we're open to it, we'll be led, we'll be opened up in a different way. So the parables are slowing us down. We don't know half of what Jesus is talking about here. We've got to dial in a different way. I think a second thing that's going on is Jesus is dismantling our stereotypes. And thank you, Pat, for unpacking that part of that for us already. I love that going away outfit. I think you should rock it again. So dismantling stereotypes. Jesus, if you look at the parables, is reframing reality for us. And then a third part of it is we will not get the parables. They will not make sense to us unless we are active participants. If we don't have a willing heart, if we don't have an open imagination, we simply will not get what Jesus is saying. And there were lots of people who heard these parables and it just completely went over their heads because they weren't open. They weren't actively engaged. And so for us, it's like, okay, Lord, how might we in this season hear afresh? We've been talking this year about the Rhema word, the freshly spoken word. I think the parables at their best are freshly spoken every time we hear them. And there's an invitation in them for us. This might be a little bit of a stretch, but we're splashing paint everywhere. I was thinking about different passages in Scripture and the different postures that Jesus might be after when it comes to the parables. And I reckon the patron saint of parables is actually all the way back with Moses. Because Jesus is literally throwing stuff alongside us. And if we're not actually willing to turn and engage with it, we're going to miss it. And I don't know how many times you might have heard the story of Moses and the burning bush, but I guess I just always assumed that this burning bush was right in the middle of the path and Moses would have tripped over it or got burnt by it unless he actually engaged with it. But if you read Exodus 3 carefully, the Lord is seeking to get Moses' attention. And it's not until Moses says, I will now turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. It's not until that moment where Moses turns aside and checks it out that the moment of encounter happens. So when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside, God then spoke to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses responds, here I am. And history changes. But notice his posture. Notice his curiosity. It could easily have been otherwise. Who knows? There might have been other burning bushes around and people just were oblivious to it. Moses was the bloke who turned aside. Moses had to ask the question, what is this doing here? And I don't know about you, but in key moments of my life where God is getting my attention, when I'm being led into what's called a liminal space, the in-between, having to let go of what I'm currently in and stepping out into something new, God often speaks to me in more abstract ways, in the metaphorical, using symbol. And that's what Jesus is doing in the parables. He's opening up these opportunities for us to step out of something that we think we know into something new that God has for us. So let's slap some paint around as we jump into Luke's gospel specifically. All of the parables that we'll be looking at, and if you've been following the lectionary along, this reading of Jesus setting his face towards Jerusalem. Jesus deciding that he was heading to the cross. It happens in the middle of Luke's gospel. And I don't know if you can remember back to Johnny Farnham and his farewell tour that went on for years and years and years. Jesus is a bit like this. His farewell tour is a big road trip. He's doing a big sweep of everything. And all of the parables that we're looking at in July, August, September are all in this patch of Jesus taking this big arc towards Jerusalem. But interestingly, when you look at this passage and it says, as the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven, he resolutely set out for Jerusalem, or he set his face towards Jerusalem in the older versions. And he sent messengers on ahead who went to a Samaritan village. That's a bit odd. The Samaritans were kind of the half-breeds and a people group that was very difficult for the Jewish people. And it's not unlike, let's just say, ahead of Friday night when the Hawks are playing Geelong. It's not unlike Sam Mitchell going, hey, blokes, I've got a really good idea. Let's go down to Geelong where I'll meet with Jeremy Cameron or one of their other star players and we'll have lunch together and we'll just pack out Geelong on our way to the MCG. It doesn't make sense. It's a big arc. It's the wrong way. It's with the wrong people group. And nobody's happy about it. They go to a Samaritan village to get things ready for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was heading to Jerusalem. What is Jesus doing? And this is the start of this run of parables. And the first in the run of parables is the Good Samaritan. In this context, Jesus taking the long way round to Jerusalem, he's in Samaria with the Samaritans, and he places alongside us a story where a Good Samaritan is the hero. And even within the story, there was a beaten up bloke on the other side of the road placed alongside. And not unlike the shimmering bush, the priest and the Levite didn't turn aside. It's only the Good Samaritan who did. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but it's not just parables that are thrown alongside us in our lives. Neighbours are as well. About what's up, what's down. And yet the parable of Jesus, the big splash of paint placed alongside us, is flipping everything around. It says, okay, if you want to talk about neighbours, let's talk about neighbours. Are you becoming a neighbour? That's Jesus' question. Completely flips it around. Jumping to our reading today. Once again, there is a critical frame for our parables. And they're two little verses that we can easily skim over. The first few words of Luke chapter 15, which has 3 parables of lost things, starts with these words. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. Before we move on from that phrase, let me just invite you to sit with it for a moment. Why is it that tax collectors, sinners, all the least likely, would be actively leaning in? Would be actively gathering around Jesus? What was it about him? I reckon he's really funny. I reckon he's really engaging. I think people want what he's having, want what he's got. The other big grumble they have, All the people who think Jesus should know better is he eats with the wrong people. He's a party goer. And maybe our picture of Jesus needs to be updated in order for verses like this to make sense. What was it about Jesus that meant so many people from all walks of life wanted to be with him and near him? So you've got that on the one hand, the active posture of actively gathering. And then on the other hand, you've got but. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and I've just gathered the three words that are used to translate the Greek word here. They muttered, grumbled, and complained. Arms crossed. We are not amused. Muttering, grumbling, and complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. This is the context for the parables that follow. The first one, then Jesus tells them a parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. And then this flows into a second parable. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. And then this flows into a third parable, which wasn't read this morning, but is well known, is the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. And I've just highlighted in green so that we can notice it. Jesus starts out with the 100, and then it's the 10, and then he's zoning in on the father with 2 beloved sons. And if you know the parable of the prodigal son, I just have a question for you. If this is the frame, who do you think people are thinking about when the first son, the one who squanders everything, the one who is reckless with his life, who do you think they're thinking of in the crowd? It's this first group of the people who don't fit. And then when the second son, with his arms crossed, is angry and refuses to go in, who is everyone thinking of when Jesus is telling this parable? It's all the religious heavies, those who do not approve. And in the way that Jesus sets up all these parables, I think what he's seeking to do is to help people appreciate God's desire to find, to seek out, to welcome all who are beloved. And this is back to the way Pat was leading us before, an open table. Jesus had an open table, all are beloved. What is this story doing here? And I think particularly for a moment to think about the religious people of the day. I think Jesus' heart was to slow down their comprehension, dismantle the stereotypes, help them to appreciate a little more why Jesus was so passionate about slapping the paint everywhere, about doing this public art, about welcoming all who would come. And I think his hope was that the people who taught the law of Moses would become more like Moses. Those who are curious enough to turn aside and check out what's shimmering over here in Jesus' ministry. And I wonder what that looks like for you and for I today. I knew Penny's choice of songs today, and I knew that we would be singing Amazing Grace immediately before the message. And for myself this week, I've been sitting with this line, I once was lost, but now am found. It's a beautiful line in a song. And I think at its best, it's naming this decisive difference that Jesus can make in our lives. But at its worst, I can sing that in a way where I'm like the Pharisees. I went through that phase once of being lost. I'm found now. And I think what would have broken Jesus' heart is the arrogance. The arrogance of those who should have known better. Unwilling to yield. Unwilling to soften. And that's the check in my heart this week. Lord, how are you inviting me to soften? Where do you desire there to be more humility, more curiosity in my life? We can be overconfident in our way of seeing the world and so stuck in our stereotypes. Jesus, this creative, abstract artist, is just wanting to mess with us a little, loosen it up. Invite us to see there are more colours. There are more shades. There is more opportunity than I'm aware of right now. I just want to close with a memory that I have. I thought I knew what hide and seek was all about. I had learned it as a child, and I delighted in hiding and being sneaky, being the most cunning, being difficult to find. And I thought that was the joy in the game. And then I played it with my daughter. And I went, oh, maybe this game is actually about being found. My daughter was hopeless at hide and seek if the aim was to be hard to find. But I still remember fondly to this day her absolute delight, her squeals of delight when she was found by me. We've got to get in touch with that if we want to understand God. If we want to understand Jesus. If we want to even begin to understand what these parables are about. God delights, squeals with delight when he finds you. And Jesus, who shows up, we're told, in the stranger, delights when we turn aside and are willing to make room to find Jesus in disguise. And as we move into our final song, I just want to invite you to sit with these words. You may not be able to read them, but it's 2 verses from our reading this morning. And this is Jesus telling the story of the lost sheep. And talking about the shepherd, Jesus says, and when he finds the lost sheep, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders. That picture, it's conveying for us the delight. He joyfully puts it on his shoulders, and then he calls all his friends, all his neighbours together and says, rejoice with me. Rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep. Let's move into a time of singing a song that delights in praising the one who finds us, praising the one who sets us free.